New York Times writes this, quote, in Michigan, where nearly half of voters said abortion was their top issue, Democrats won both chambers of the legislature and re-elected Governor Gretchen Whitmer, giving the party a trifecta of power for the first time in 40 years. As our next guest, Michigan State Senator Mallory McMorrow puts it, quote, State House, State Senate, Governor. Hate did not win. Joining us now is Mallory McMorrow. So you were confident when we last talked ahead of these elections. What did you feel that maybe you didn't want to say before, but that was affirmed in this week's results?
You know, you always want to be cautiously optimistic so you don't stop working. But on the ground for months now, the energy hasn't died down. And the more volunteers I talk to, even in some of our toughest districts around the state, people kept telling me, this feels like 2018 again. This feels like 2018 again. And that was huge. That meant we were on the right track. That meant that people stayed engaged and they were going to come with us all the way through the finish line.
And what, you brought our attention back to the campaign that Governor Whitmer had run ahead of the election, and she really had a pretty stunning and decisive victory there. What, as we sort of start looking at the lessons, what can the country and Democrats and maybe even some Republicans learn from the campaign she waged?
I think we as a team in Michigan worked together. The governor got reelected with an incredibly healthy margin. She performed better than she did in 2018. And we flipped the state Senate for the first time in my entire lifetime. Michigan is now a blue trifecta state heading into 2024, which is something that's only happened 4 times in the past 100 years, believe it or not. And I want to go back to your last segment because this really came down to character and quality of candidates. I think abortion and Dobbs was a perfect example of women were set to lose a right that we've had for 50 years. And when we're coming out of the past 2 years of just nonstop chaos, that felt like the last straw to a lot of people. So the attitude that I think so many, particularly women, were carrying forward is, who is the person I want in the trenches with me? Who is going to lead us out of chaos, not back into more chaos? People want to move on from 2020. People want to maintain our fundamental rights. And that's something that Governor Whitmer did early. And it's also something we did with every single candidate on the ballot to really diverge from the politics of hate and fear and chaos. And it worked.
You are one of the best people at going right in to the wedge culture attacks that the Republicans want to wage against the Democratic Party. I like to say that some people saw and learned from that and got themselves on offense on these issues. The truth is, the first exit poll data we saw was that 60% of voters opposed Dobbs and 60% of voters disapproved the Supreme Court. Is the Democratic Party ready to make the Supreme Court an issue that gets the whole party and this broad coalition on offense for 30 years, the way the Republicans did for the last 30?
I think we have to, especially when it comes to attacks on our rights. The Supreme Court has already nodded to taking away marriage equality, contraception, and people do not want to go backwards. So what we have to do as a party all around the country is really bring the issue home for people. I think talking about the Supreme Court still feels like something that happens very far away in an ivory tower somewhere. But losing your fundamental right is something people are willing to fight for and join your team to be a part of. And if we've learned anything, and I think we have, we've got to stand up for people, we've got to fight, and we've got to bring them along with us to show the way forward out of this incredibly chaotic moment.
You and I talked right before the election, and I had heard from a source in Michigan and a candidate in Pennsylvania that something turned in that last week, that the last week felt much better than the 2 weeks before that. Do you know what that was? Have you kind of gone back and figured that out?
It did. It really did feel hopeful. And it was something that for those of us in places like Michigan, and I'm sure my counterparts in Pennsylvania too, it almost felt like we haven't known this feeling in a long time. And I think it's the push of the get out the vote time period, where at that point, you're not really thinking about strategy anymore. You're just going and you're getting out there and you're talking to people and you're holding rallies. And the mood was celebratory. It felt very much like the Women's March did right after Donald Trump got elected, where, I expected the worst, but people who attended women's marches all around the country left those events feeling hopeful, like we found our people and we found how powerful we are. And that's what it felt like on the ground in the last week here in Michigan. It felt really good.
Governor Whitmer, yourself, President Obama made clear that voters didn't have to choose between living in a democracy and having their freedom and caring about inflation. Governor Whitmer ran one of the tightest messages tying reproductive freedoms to economic opportunity. And the whole idea that democracy was this luxury issue when you have high inflation was something that I think some of the best candidates this cycle on the Democratic side made clear was a false choice. It was a construct from the right. And it was sort of knocked down. What is the lesson then, as we sort of continue to, I think, have an electorate that's uneasy and anxious about the cost of things?
I think what Governor Whitmer did really well was she planted a flag early on abortion and reproductive rights, well before the Dobbs decision, well before everything happened. So in Michigan, we were proactive instead of reactive. And that really freed her up to talk about the economy, to talk about inflation. And what she did and Democrats have done in places where we've been successful is acknowledging that these are issues. Don't run away from them. But at the same time that Republicans were acknowledging inflation and then blaming trans kids who want to play sports, Democrats were saying, hey, it's a tough time right now, but Governor Whitmer talked about the record investment in education, in getting kids back on track after going through a pandemic and learning loss, about expanding access to child care. And it really resonated with voters. Again, it's who do you want in the trenches with you? That it's a hard time right now. And yeah, we've got progress, but we have to keep making progress, not pretending like the issues don't exist, not blaming somebody else, and not refusing to offer any solutions. And that's all the Republican Party had.
That is indeed. Michigan State Senator, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Mallory McMorrow, thank you.
Thank you.